Imagine being told that the most dangerous moment in your life has arrived, and instead of running away, you decide to stay exactly where the danger is. That is the extraordinary story surrounding Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, during the darkest years of the Second World War. Buckingham Palace was not simply a royal residence. During the war, it became a symbol. Every time bombs fell on London, every time people woke to the sound of sirens, every time families wondered whether their homes would still be standing in the morning, the palace remained at the center of the national story, and at a time when many expected the royal family to leave London for somewhere safer, the Queen Mother made a decision that would become one of the most remembered examples of royal wartime defiance. She stayed, but the real story is more complicated and much more fascinating than the simple claim that she refused to leave Buckingham Palace for 14 months. So today, we're going inside that story. Why did she stay? What happened when Buckingham Palace itself was bombed? And how did one woman's decision become a powerful message to millions of British people who were living through fear, destruction, and uncertainty? To understand it, we need to go back to 1939. Europe was entering one of the darkest periods in modern history. Britain had declared war on Nazi Germany, and London knew that the conflict would not remain somewhere far away. The threat was coming directly toward the British capital. The royal family was an obvious target. Buckingham Palace was one of the most recognizable buildings in Britain, and its symbolic importance made it incredibly valuable as a target for German bombing. There was a practical argument for moving the royal family away from London, and that argument was strong. The palace was not a bunker. It was not designed to withstand a modern bombing campaign. The windows could shatter, buildings could collapse, fires could spread, and the people inside were not protected simply because they were members of the royal family. But Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, believed that leaving London could send the wrong message. Millions of ordinary British citizens did not have the luxury of simply escaping the danger. They were staying in their homes. They were sleeping in shelters. They were sending their husbands, sons, brothers, and fathers into military service. Children were being evacuated. Families were being separated. Entire neighborhoods were being transformed by bombing. And the Queen Mother understood something very important. Leadership is not only about giving speeches. Sometimes leadership is about being seen. The royal family could not remove the danger from London, but they could choose whether they would experience at least some of that danger alongside the people they represented. And that distinction mattered. The Queen Mother became particularly famous for her attitude towards staying in London. There is a widely repeated story that she essentially refused to leave Buckingham Palace because she wanted to remain with the British people. The spirit of that story is real, although the exact details are often simplified in popular retellings. The royal family did make use of safer locations, including Windsor Castle, particularly during the most dangerous periods. But the Queen Mother continued to spend substantial time in London and made public appearances throughout the Blitz. And those appearances became enormously important, because imagine what London looked like during the Blitz. The sky could suddenly light up with explosions. Buildings disappeared overnight. Streets that had been filled with shops and families could become piles of broken brick. People were exhausted. People were frightened. And yet, in the middle of all this destruction, the Queen Mother appeared in public. She visited damaged areas. She met people who had lost their homes. She spoke with workers. She visited hospitals. She walked through streets where bombs had recently fallen, and every time she appeared, she was communicating something without necessarily saying it. We are still here. That message was powerful. There is another famous story connected to the bombing of Buckingham Palace. The palace itself was hit several times during the war. On one occasion, bombs caused significant damage to parts of the building. The Queen Mother and King George VI were in the palace when it happened. And instead of treating the bombing as a reason to separate themselves completely from the public, the royal couple used the experience to reinforce their connection with ordinary Londoners. The Queen Mother reportedly expressed the idea that now she could understand the experience of people who had been bombed. Whether every version of the famous quote is perfectly accurate is less important than the larger truth behind it. The royal family was no longer simply watching the destruction from a distance. They were experiencing it too, and that changed the emotional relationship between the monarchy and the public. Think about that for a moment. A palace represents privilege. A palace represents wealth. A palace represents power. But when bombs strike the palace as well as ordinary homes, the image changes. Suddenly, the palace becomes part of the same city that is suffering, and the Queen Mother understood the power of that symbolism. She became one of the most visible representatives of British morale. Her appearance mattered, her clothes mattered, her smile mattered. Her willingness to walk through damaged neighborhoods mattered, not because fashion or ceremony could stop bombs. They couldn't. But because war is fought psychologically as well as physically. If people believe they have already lost, their ability to continue fighting becomes weaker. And during the Blitz, Britain desperately needed people to believe that the country could survive. The Queen Mother became part of that message. But there was another reason her story became so compelling. She was not presented as a fearless superhero who felt no fear. That would have made her less human. Instead, her courage came from continuing despite danger. That is a very different kind of bravery. Courage does not necessarily mean that your heart is calm. Sometimes courage means that your heart is terrified, and you keep walking anyway. The Queen Mother understood the emotional importance of appearing beside ordinary people. When hospitals were damaged, she visited. When neighborhoods were destroyed, she went there. When people were exhausted, she showed them that someone was still watching, still listening, and still standing beside them. And this helped create an image of the royal family that would remain powerful for generations. But let's return to the question at the center of our story. Why would anyone stay in a palace when bombs were falling? Why not simply leave? The answer lies partly in symbolism. Imagine if the royal family had disappeared from London completely. Imagine the newspapers reporting that the King and Queen had escaped to safety while ordinary Londoners remained under attack. Even if leaving had been completely reasonable from a safety perspective, the emotional effect could have been devastating. People might have asked, why should we continue fighting if our own leaders have left? The Queen Mother appears to have understood that perception. She knew that the British public was watching, and she knew that sometimes a leader has to accept personal risk in order to maintain public confidence. This is one reason her wartime image became so strong. But there is also something deeply human about her story. She wasn't a soldier. She wasn't standing on a battlefield with a weapon. Her battlefield was psychological. She was fighting against fear, against despair, against the feeling that destruction meant defeat, and she fought that battle by showing up over and over again. Now, Here's where the story becomes even more interesting. The famous 14 months idea should not be treated as a perfectly literal historical statement that she continuously remained inside Buckingham Palace without ever going elsewhere. The wartime movements of the royal family were more complicated. Windsor Castle became an important refuge, particularly because it offered greater protection than central London. The King and Queen could spend nights there and return to London for official duties and visits. So the real significance is not that she physically remained inside Buckingham Palace every single day for 14 months. The significance is that she refused to abandon London emotionally or symbolically. She kept returning. She kept appearing. She kept putting herself in front of the public. And that distinction actually makes the story more powerful. Because courage is not always one dramatic decision. Sometimes it is a repeated decision. Every morning, you wake up and choose to continue. Every time fear tells you to disappear, you choose to show up. Every time circumstances become worse, you choose not to surrender your sense of duty. That was the image the Queen Mother created, and the public responded to it. People saw her visiting bomb sites. They saw her talking to victims. They saw her standing in damaged streets. And they understood that the royal family was not completely removed from their suffering. The monarchy had become part of the national experience of the war. Now, there is an important lesson hidden inside this story. It is easy to look at historical figures and imagine them as larger than life. We see photographs of the Queen Mother smiling. We see her perfectly dressed. We see her standing beside the king. And we forget that behind those photographs was a person living through one of the most frightening periods in modern history. She knew that bombs could fall. She knew that the palace could be attacked. She knew that people around her were dying. She knew that Britain itself was in danger, yet she continued to perform her role, and that is why her story still captures people's imagination, because deep down, everyone understands fear. Everyone understands the desire to run from danger. Everyone understands the temptation to choose safety. What is harder to understand is choosing responsibility when safety is available. That is what makes the Queen Mother's wartime story so memorable. She became a symbol not because she was invincible, but because she was visible. And visibility matters during a crisis. When people are frightened, they look for signs that tomorrow is still possible. A leader walking through a destroyed neighborhood can become that sign. A familiar face appearing on the streets can become that sign. A simple conversation with someone who has lost everything can become that sign. The Queen Mother understood this instinctively. She didn't have the power to rebuild every destroyed house. She couldn't stop German aircraft from crossing the sky. She couldn't guarantee that every British soldier would return home. But she could stand beside people. And sometimes, standing beside someone is more powerful than giving them 100 speeches. That may be the most important part of this entire story. The Queen Mother's wartime legacy was not created by one dramatic sentence. It was created through thousands of small acts of presence, visiting, listening, walking, smiling, returning, showing up again and again and again. Eventually, the war ended. The bombs stopped falling. London began rebuilding. Families began returning to homes. The country slowly moved toward peace. But the emotional memory of the Blitz remained. And so did the image of the Queen Mother walking through the ruins. For many people, she represented something bigger than royalty. She represented endurance. The ability to remain standing when everything around you appears to be falling apart. And that is why the story continues to be retold. Not because Buckingham Palace was magically safe. It wasn't. Not because the Queen Mother never experienced fear. She did. And not because every popular detail about the 14 months is literally accurate. It isn't. The real story is more nuanced, but perhaps that makes it even more inspiring. Because the truth is not that she simply sat inside a palace and refused to move. The truth is that during a terrifying national crisis, she understood the importance of being present with her people. She chose duty over comfort, visibility over isolation, and resilience over fear. Her story reminds us that history is not always changed by the person holding the biggest weapon. Sometimes history remembers the person who simply refused to disappear. So, the next time you hear the statement that the Queen Mother refused to leave Buckingham Palace for 14 months, remember the deeper story behind those words. Remember the bombs. Remember the damaged streets. Remember the frightened families. Remember the hospitals. Remember the people looking toward the royal family for reassurance. And remember the woman who repeatedly stepped into that uncertainty and said, through her actions, we will face this together. That is why her wartime story still matters. Because bravery isn't always loud. Sometimes bravery is quiet. Sometimes it is putting on your coat in the morning, stepping outside, and doing your duty even though you don't know what the day will bring. Sometimes courage is simply refusing to abandon the people who are counting on you. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson the Queen Mother left behind. When the world around you is falling apart, you may not be able to control the storm, but you can decide whether you will stand. You can decide whether you will help. You can decide whether you will give other people hope. And sometimes that decision becomes your legacy. If you enjoyed this journey into one of the most fascinating chapters of royal history, don't let the story end here. Hit the like button if you found this story interesting. Share this video with someone who loves history. And subscribe to the channel for more extraordinary stories about the people, decisions, mysteries, and moments that shaped our world. And most importantly, stay curious, because behind every famous photograph, every royal title, and every line in a history book, there is a human story waiting to be discovered. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.